Today's lecture is underwritten by a woman who loves Chautauqua. Please join me in thanking her as we thank all of you for your continued support of Chautauqua. Dr. Jay Rosen has been on the faculty at New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute since 1986. He is currently the director of Studio 20, a master's level concentration that focuses on innovation and adapting journalism to the web. He's also the author of PressThink.org, a blog about the fate of the press in the digital era and the challenges involved in journalism today. PressThink won the Reporters Without Borders 2005 Freedom Blog Award for Outstanding Defense of Free Expression. Dr. Rosen has served as a member of the Wikipedia Advisory Board and the Advisory Board of Digital Media First. He is currently a consultant to Postmedia and serves on the advisory board of the New Republic magazine. As a press critic, he has contributed to Columbia Journalism Review, The Washington Post, Newsday, and has written for several online platforms, including Poynter.org. He has previously been a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University, and has also held a fellowship at the Gannett Center for Media Studies at Columbia University. His books include What Are Journalists For?, which cover the rise of the civic journalism movement. A native of our nearby Buffalo, Dr. Rosen briefly worked at the Buffalo Courier-Express before beginning graduate study. He received his PhD from New York University. The title of Dr. Rosen's lecture this morning, Why is the President Trying to Discredit the American Press? Please join me in welcoming Jay Rosen to the Chautauqua stage.
It's amazing. I've never spoken anywhere like this. This is really something. Thank you very much, Matt. And thank you so much to a woman who loves Chautauqua. That gave me a chill. It's like somebody telling you you have a secret admirer. Did that ever happen to you, like in high school? It used to happen to me all the time. Not too much anymore, though. So thank you for that. I haven't even started yet, and it's already one of the highlights of my career to address you this morning. It's not only the great tradition that we are joining my meeting here today, it's not only the ghosts of great speakers like Margaret Mead, Thurgood Marshall, Elie Wiesel, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, David McCullough. And it's not only the gravity of the subject matter of rethinking ethics for journalism in a digital age, or the speakers to follow, like Kathleen Jamieson and Marty Barron of the Washington Post. It's also the fact, as Matt mentioned, that I grew up in Buffalo. I went to school there. I lived there for the first 24 years of my life. Then I moved to New York. Thank you. Then I moved to New York City, and I never came back. But this is a very familiar landscape to me. It feels like a very familiar space, even though this is my first time at Chautauqua. When people go to the doctor today, as many of you know, they don't just listen to what their physician says and take their course of treatment and get their prescription and say, "Thank you very much, doctor." Now, when they get a course of treatment or they get a new prescription, they go home and they go on the internet. Did you ever do that? And yet they look up what they supposedly have wrong with them. And they take a look at people who have that condition, and they read about the medicine that they have been prescribed. And they have other sources of information available to them, which, of course, changes their relationship with their doctor. Because now it's not that people don't trust doctors anymore. It's not like we reject what they tell us. But because we have other sources of information, because we can talk to other patients, because we can converse horizontally with peers and not just vertically with authorities, doctors have to change their relationship with their patients. They have to be more tolerant. They have to explain what they're recommending more. They have to be aware that people might have questions. People might be able to argue with them. And as I said, it's not that doctors have lost their authority, but a smart doctor would realize that they have to change the terms of their authority now that people have this fuller source of information. So we know about that. You have practiced that. I have practiced that. And now imagine if, at the same time that was happening, the President of the United States was saying every week, "Don't trust your doctor. Actually, they're trying to make you sicker. Your doctors don't know anything about the human body." Imagine what would happen in the medical profession if from the very top of the society, an effort to discredit that profession was underway. It would be a crisis. Well, that is what's happening to the American press. There is an organized campaign to discredit the mainstream press in this country going on right now, and it is working. Imagine if the president was saying, scientists are trying to falsify the data they use in their experiments, or accountants are engaged routinely in fraud, or engineers don't care if their bridges fall down. That would be an analogous situation to the one we face in journalists. There's an organized campaign to discredit the mainstream press in this country, and it is working. It is working. What I mean by that is when journalists get to their desks in the morning, between 20 and 30% of the public, of the electorate, is already lost to them before they even log on. Meaning they don't trust them, they don't listen to them, they're not there in the audience, or they are actively hostile to what journalists do. So in my talk this morning, I'm going to tell you what I mean by an organized campaign to discredit the mainstream press. I will try and put this development in context, explain where it comes from, and then I'll try to connect this organized campaign to discredit the press to other equally alarming trends that are in motion, like, for example, the put down of our diplomatic professionals in the State Department who are being isolated and driven out. And then I will close with some ideas about how the press can restore trust in what it does, which is the only way out of this mess. But before that, I want to begin by telling you where I'm coming from on this subject, because that is actually one of the keys to restoring trust in journalism, is tell people where you're coming from, and they are more likely to believe you because they can apply whatever discount rate they want to what you're saying. So here's where I'm coming from, and I urge you to factor these things in when you decide what you think about my ideas. First, I'm not a journalist, but a critic of the press and a scholar of media. So I would be somewhat analogous to, in a medical school, a sociologist of medicine who studies the medical profession but is not himself a doctor. I am, as you will soon discover, not a supporter of President Trump. I didn't vote for him. I'm a critic of the president who is very alarmed at what is happening. Some other words that you might want to shout at me if you're of that mind. I'm a liberal. That's me. If you have in your mind, some might, if you know New York City, an image of a Upper West Side Jewish intellectual type person. That's me. I'm cosmopolitan. Have you heard that? That's me. I am definitely cosmopolitan, which means I'm at home in any large city with air conditioning. And I'm coastal. You know, I live in Manhattan, which is not really America. It's an island off the coast of America. Right? So you are permitted to call me that as well. I'm very disturbed by what is happening in American democracy. I'm still trying to get over the shock of the 2016 election, which was a devastating event for me intellectually, in the sense that lots of things I thought I understood, I really didn't understand. I'm not a cheerleader for the American press. In fact, I'm a critic of many of its practices. I argue with journalists all the time. If you follow me on social media, you'll see what I mean. I even fight with them sometimes. I can be quite unpopular with some of them. So I'm a critic, but I'm a loyal critic. I think we need the press. I think we need it to be better than it is. I think we need it to be stronger than it is. And so I'm concerned. Okay, so let's dive in. There's an organized campaign to discredit the mainstream press in this country, and it is working. One measure that it's working is Gallup, as you know, does regular studies about trust in institutions. And according to the Gallup organization, the most trusted polling organization in the country, trust in the mass media fell among Republicans from 52% in 1998 to 32% in 2015, 52% in 1988 to 32% in 2015, and then fell in 1 year to 14%. From 2015 to 2016. Among independents, trust in the mass media fell from 53% in 1998 to 30% in 2016. And even among Democrats, it went down from 59 in 98 to 51 in 2016. So something is going on there, especially when you see a drop in 1 year from 32 to 14%. That doesn't happen in polling very often. Things like that, long-term trends like that don't plunge within 1 year. So by an organized campaign, what I mean is, at the top is President Trump routinely labeling the press enemies of the people, calling news he doesn't like not just biased or incomplete, but fake. That is, simulated, manufactured, claiming the press makes up sources, not that it has limited sources or biased sources or imperfect sources, but that it makes up its sources, or they have no sources. Promoting not a healthy skepticism, but rejection and dismissal of what journalists do. It's extreme. We've never seen anything like it. Nixon hated the press. That's true. We know about this because we have heard the tapes. But as you recall, the tapes were private conversations. Nixon hated the press, but he didn't hate the press in public. It's a very different thing than projecting hatred towards an institution in public. So first we have President Trump declaring journalists enemy of the people. Then at the bottom of the pyramid, there's an army of online trolls and activists who shout down stories they reject, dismiss the institutions of the press as corrupt, harass journalists individually, call them purveyors of fake news. Any journalist who's active online experiences this treatment daily. Increasingly, journalists at the local level are experiencing the same thing. And then in the middle, between the top and the base of the pyramid, we have mediating institutions that connect the top and the bottom, like talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, Matt Drudge, Breitbart, and of course, Fox News. And they connect what the president is doing to this sort of grassroots level. So that's what I mean by an organized campaign. Where did this come from? Well, it's the culmination of 48 years of doing Republican Party politics by raging at elites and identifying as elite the people on your television set who are telling you the news. It began in 1969 with Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, who in a series of speeches began to criticize the liberal media. And at that time, Agnew's complaint was very mild compared to what we heard today. What he was complaining about was that when President Nixon gave a speech to the country, after his speech, the television networks would put pundits on the air who disagreed and kind of undermined what the president was saying. And Agnew was mad about that. And that's what his speeches attacking the news media were about. Well, there's a very long way between these commentators who come on after the president's speech are unfairly criticizing him, which is what Agnew was saying in 1969, and enemy of the people in 2016. So that's a measure of how far we've come. Other factors contributing to this, however, go way beyond Donald Trump and way beyond the current political moment. There's the decline of the local press, which Matt mentioned. Local newspapers, which once were the breeding ground for trust in journalism. That's how people form their initial attachment to journalists, learn to follow the news, learn to trust the news through their local newspaper. Local newspapers are in decline in many ways. Their staffs have been decimated by the economic crisis in journalism. The quality of local newspapers has been sinking for more than 10 years now. And that's a crisis because that's where people initially form their attachment to journalists, as I said, and learn that good journalists can help you in your life. There's a larger economic crisis which has to do with the erosion of advertising, most of which now in the digital era is being captured by Facebook and Google. And so many large news organizations have seen the number of reporters they're able to hire fall, and they are regularly forced to scramble and change what they do to keep up with a shifting digital climate. We're also operating in a low-trust environment for institutions of all kinds, not just the news media, including, of course, politicians and leaders of institutions. And those are the people who are in the news. So the very same people who you see in the news regularly, like the Senate Majority Leader, are themselves increasingly mistrusted. So that's a major factor as well. Then there's the homogeneity and coastal concentration of American journalists in a few large cities, which is another way of saying that the American press is not very diverse. It's it tends to be quite uniform in the cultural backgrounds and assumptions of its practitioners. In addition to that, I think political journalism in this country took a wrong turn a number of years ago when it began to focus a lot of its attention on insiders, professionals, operatives in politics whose job is to manipulate the electorate. You know what I mean? Like when somebody comes on your screen on CNN or NBC and it says, under them, it says, Democratic strategist. You know the people I'm talking about? And they're now going to talk about the news with us. It's really kind of strange because what a Democratic strategist's job is to manipulate people and figure out how to win and persuade them to vote for the Democrats. And the notion that we should find out about politics through the eyes of professionals in it who are paid to manipulate us is, I think, a wrong turn. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, Max Weber was a very smart man. That's the only time Max Weber has ever gotten applause. It's amazing. Anyway, Max Weber distinguished between people who live for politics and people who live off. People who live for politics are activists. They want to get something done. They want to change the world. They want something to be different. So they live for it because they care about the outcome. People who live off politics are professionals. It's their industry. It's their job. They make their living that way. And they have to survive no matter who's in power. So the wrong turn that I'm talking about in political journalism was when journalists began to look at the world, and especially at the electorate, at people like you, through the eyes of those who live off politics, the strategists, the handlers, the pollsters, the consultants, the people who are in Iowa 3 years before the election. You know, you're sitting there watching the news and somebody on television says, how is this going to play with white working class voters in Pennsylvania? That's what I'm talking about. That was a wrong term. There's also the increasingly dim prospect that we can have a fact-based debate when the leader of the free world feels free to broadcast false claims and make stuff up, like he saw Muslims cheering on 9/11. When the leader of the free world literally doesn't care if what he's saying is true, that's a new condition. Now, politicians have always lied. They've always manipulated the facts. They have always tried to avoid uncomfortable truths. That is a hazard of their way of life. But we've never had a president that didn't care if what he was saying was true. That's a new condition. There's also another thing even more disturbing than that going on today I call it verification in reverse. Verification in reverse. So verification is when you take something that might be true and you try and nail it down with facts, with evidence, with proof. That's a big part of what journalists do, is they attempt to verify what happened. Verification in reverse is when you take something that's been nailed down and you introduce doubt about it. And the doubt causes reactions and fury, and a great deal of energy is released. And you can try and power a political movement with that energy. And President Trump began his political career using this method of verification in reverse when he became a birther and used the reactions to that controversy, if you can call it that, to begin to raise his profile. So there's verification in reverse is becoming a kind of tool of politics, but it's in many ways it's anti-journalistic. Then there's the development that my teacher and mentor in graduate school, Neil Postman, wrote about in 1985 called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and a great book that I definitely recommend to you, has renewed relevance. Because Postman's argument in this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, was that entertainment and the logic of entertainment is sort of breaking out of the arenas in which it is legitimate, like sitcoms on television and movie theaters, and is becoming the way we organize everything from education to child rearing to politics. And when the logic of entertainment overtakes spheres where it is not supposed to be operating, you have a huge problem. And of course, our current president is an entertainment figure, and that is how he became a presence in our national life, was through his success as an entertainer. And that's also something contributing to this resentment against journalists. And then there's the rise of digital platforms like Facebook and Google, which organize much more of our information life today, but take no editorial responsibility. They don't want to be journalists. They don't have journalists. There is no editor-in-chief of Facebook by design. And so the companies that have more and more power over our information lives don't feel that they have any editorial responsibility. That's also a factor. Finally, after the failure to detect a faulty case for war in 2003, after failing to adequately sound the alarm before the financial crash of 2008, after the debacle of the 2016 election, the American press did not create a 9/11 style commission to find out what happened. It didn't hold national hearings to discover what went wrong. It didn't engage in any real searching or far-reaching reforms. And this is a problem because the institution of the press is not much of an institution. It's very hard for it to change. It's hard for it to reflect on itself. Journalists are quite aware that there are problems in their profession. They're very anxious about the current moment, but it's very difficult for them to change what they're doing because they're kind of a herd of independent minds. Imagine that, a herd of independent minds. You get the worst of both worlds, right? It's a herd, and it acts like a herd, but everybody in the herd thinks they're an independent contrarian, so it's very hard to lead a herd of independent minds. Try to do it sometime. Finally, there's a strange development in our world in which the old battle between left and right is still there. It's raging more dramatically than ever, seems more intense than ever. But underneath that, it's kind of being replaced by another conflict, different conflict, between open and closed, open societies and closed societies, open to immigrants, open to changes in morality, like it's okay to be a transgendered person, open to disruption, especially by technology, open to the rest of the world, open to information that threatens belief, open to markets, open to trade. There's that perspective, and then there's closed to immigrants, closed to world markets, closed to new information that threatens belief. And what's happening is that our politics is trying to reorganize itself from left, right to open, closed. And as that dynamic increases, there's no doubt that journalism is kind of in the crosshairs because it stands for open. That's what journalists do. They are part of that open society. So, we need to connect these developments in journalism with some other things that are going on at the same time. This open and closed debate is one. Another example is what's happening in the State Department right now. I don't know if you're following this closely, but most of the positions that President Trump has to fill in the State Department are completely empty, and nobody has even been nominated for them because the White House doesn't trust the kind of people who are qualified for those jobs. And diplomatic expertise, that is, people who have worked for decades in international affairs, are being pushed aside and are quitting and ejecting themselves from the State Department because they know that nobody wants their expertise. And the Secretary of State himself, I don't know if you've noticed this, but he kind of seems out of the loop, which is really strange because he's the nation's chief diplomat. And very often the Secretary of State doesn't actually seem to know what's going on, or what he says doesn't actually correspond to what the president is saying, which is also very strange. It used to be that if one part of the administration said something that was discordant or contradicted by another part of the administration, that used to be a problem. Remember that? Now, not only is it not a problem, it's like an operating style, which is a very strange thing. And it's part of a larger phenomenon in which expertise itself and professionalism in government, civil servants in government, are being pushed out of the frame and increasingly disregarded, while at the same time, public data, which helps us understand what is going on in our government, is being removed from public websites. So the attacks on journalists are actually part of a larger problem in which academics, civil servants, cosmopolitans, experts, globalists, professionals of different kinds are all slowly being brought under this category, enemies of the people. Disturbing. Final part of my talk is restoring trust. What can journalists start doing to restore trust? I don't think there's a solution to this. These kinds of developments I'm talking about today are deep-seated. Many of them have been building for almost 50 years. They're cultural in addition to being political. They're becoming part of the fabric of American society. So it's not going to be easy to change this. However, I think there are some things that journalists can start doing to help themselves and to help us recover trust in what they do. The first one is, I think journalists should start telling us routinely where they're coming from. Even though most people in the press still disagree with me on this, I think the whole doctrine of objectivity in journalism has become part of the problem, in that when you say to people, look, you should trust what I'm telling you because I don't have a philosophy, I don't have an ideology, I don't have an agenda, I don't have any beliefs, I don't have any starting points, I don't have any assumptions, so trust me because this is just the facts. There's something about that claim that makes people mistrust you. You know what I mean? Say, I don't have a point of view, I'm just telling you the facts, increasingly generates mistrust. Now, if that's true, and again, a lot of journalists disagree with me about this, and I can see in your faces that a lot of you disagree with me, which is cool. I think it's easier to trust somebody who says, this is not the view from nowhere, this is not the voice of God, this is not the absolute truth, this is where I'm coming from, and here's what I found in my reporting. That, to me, is a stronger basis for trust. So journalists should learn to start saying, look, this is where I'm coming from. Look, I told you where I was coming from, right? Upper West Side liberal, cosmopolitan, and you trust me. Right? Yeah. Okay, so you see how it works. In addition to that, here's where we're coming from. I think journalists should start telling us very clearly, at the current time, these are our editorial priorities. These are our priorities. So I should be able to go to CNN.com or Washington Post or Buffalo News for that matter, or the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, and find out what their current reporting priorities are, which they say are the most important things for them to report on and devote scarce resources to. Right now, strange as it seems, it's very hard to do that. You can try and figure it out by looking at the run of coverage, but there's no place where news organizations that are asking for our trust tell us about their priorities. I think they should. A third thing journalists should start doing, and many of them do this now, is when their reporting is attacked, when somebody in power says, you're fake news, or you got this completely wrong, or you made that up, or you don't have any sources, I think they should respond forcefully and argue back. If you attack our reporting, we are going to respond. And we're going to show you and the people who listen to you why you're wrong. Instead of assuming it'll fall of its own weight or people won't pay attention to that, you actually have to fight. Another thing journalists could do, and I think this is the easiest way to trust them, the most reliable way to trust them, is whenever they can, they should say to us, don't believe me? Check for yourself. Don't believe me? Here's the data. Don't believe me? Here are the studies that we use to come to this conclusion. Don't believe us? Here's everybody we interviewed. Don't believe us? Check for yourself. Because in an age of transparency, which is part of what the internet brings to us, that is much more reliable way to be trusted than, hey, we're CBS News. Come on. Right? You trust us. We're CBS News. That doesn't really work as well anymore. Don't believe us? Check for yourself. Another thing I think journalists should start doing, especially in breaking news situations like the one we had in Charlottesville this weekend, is when they report on something that's new and it's moving, it's developing, they should routinely say, and sometimes they do this, but they should do it more, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. Here's what we know, and here's what we don't know. If that became more routine, I think it would be easier to trust them because it's saying we don't know everything. This is not the voice of God. This is actually imperfect people trying to bring you the news under difficult conditions, and there's a lot we don't know. Right? I think that approach could be helpful. In addition to what we know, what we don't know, it's really important for journalists to ask their readers, viewers, listeners, what did we miss? What did we miss? What did we leave out? What did we get wrong? Tell us, help us improve our report by telling us, what did we miss? Another thing they can do is help us investigate. Because the internet makes it really easy to reach people and for people to reach you, those out in the public who know a lot about the story you're investigating can actually help you investigate it. So ProPublica.org, we're going to hear from a representative of theirs later in the week, wanted to investigate what they call patient harm. That's when somebody goes into the hospital and they actually end up worse because they're actually made sicker or injured in the hospital. That's patient harm. They wanted to do a story about how common it is for patients to actually wind up worse in hospitals around the country. The only way for them to do that story was for people to whom this had happened, families to whom this had happened, to testify to what happened. So they started a Facebook group in which they asked people who had suffered this kind of harm to contribute. And that Facebook group is still going. They run it themselves because it's very useful for them to talk among one another. And when ProPublica needs to do an update on that story, they have this group of people who know a lot about it because it happened to them that they can consult with. So help us investigate. Also helps build trust. I think it would be really interesting for our major news organizations to tell us when they are done with a big story how much it costs them to report it. People should know it's expensive to investigate stuff that people don't want you to know. It's expensive to do real journalism, but we don't have a good sense of how expensive. And so I think they should tell us, here's what it cost us to report. Now, are any of these things going to work to solve the problem? No. They might help, but the problems are too deep-rooted. Maybe they'll have an effect in the long term, but for the short term, I think the campaign to discredit the mainstream press that I talked to will go on, and right now I see it as succeeding, and that 20 to 30% number is going to probably remain about the same, or it might even go up. But I will tell you in closing what is at stake. What is at stake is the whole idea of a common world of fact. How many of you remember Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan? Yeah. Senator of New York State for a long time, my senator for a long time. He said something that's been quoted a lot, very famous remark, very important remark for this subject. He said, "You're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts." You ever hear that? You're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, now we have a lot of people who believe they are entitled to their own facts. And one of them is President of the United States. Okay, that's a problem. That's a problem. And that is where the organized campaign to discredit the mainstream press comes from, is that I don't know what to do about that, but I am more than willing to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
So as we enter into our Q&A, just a reminder for those folks who are leaving to head off to another program, please be as respectful as possible to those around you and to our speaker. Also a reminder that you can ask questions via Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2017. If we could start with some of those steps you feel can help move us towards a greater trust of the press. You talked about the need for journalists to articulate where they're coming from and how that can improve that trust perhaps with news consumers. What does that look like in someone declaring where they're coming from in terms of trust with those they're covering? Does that risk a doubt from someone in terms of how you're going to cover me as a politician or as an organization?
Right. Well, to say, here's where I'm coming from, is a risk. Let's be clear about that. It's possible that when you are leveling people like that the first reaction that they're going to have is mistrust. So we should be clear that it's a shift, and for some reporters, it really wouldn't work because reporters who have to develop sources on both sides or all sides of a highly contentious struggle, like what happens daily in Congress, it's quite possible that if reporters in Congress said, you know what, I'm a coastal elite liberal and I'm reporting on Congress, that it might undermine their work. It's definitely possible. But suppose I tell you I am myself a Upper West Side, Manhattan elite liberal, but I am going to show you how fair I can be in my reporting, and I succeed. The fact that I have told you where I'm coming from might actually increase your trust in me, because you'll be able to say, this person doesn't agree with me on everything, but he got the story right. And so I think that even though the transition to here's where I'm coming from is going to be hard and rocky, and a lot of reporters would hate it and they would tell you it won't work, I think ultimately it's a better system.
One of your other points was for a news organization to declare these are our editorial or reporting priorities. Are there examples of news organizations that are doing that and doing that well according to how you believe it can be effective?
No, what they would say is, well, just look at our front page. They would say, we make our priorities clear in what we cover. And so you can find out by being an attentive reader or a close listener. And so they would agree that of course they have priorities, and of course there are judgments that go into the news, but they would also add that they are implicit in our work. And there's probably a hesitation about putting them in a list form, because they would probably say, I'm just guessing now, well, things are always changing, and we have new priorities every week. I mean, now Charlottesville is a priority, and we didn't even know that was going to happen. So there would be resistance to that. But I still think it's worth doing.
First question from Twitter: is the newspaper becoming irrelevant?
Well, there's no doubt that newspapers are in decline as a form. They're literally in decline in the sense that their percentage of the advertising market that they command is smaller. Their staffs are smaller. If you've been a newspaper subscriber for a long time, you know that the physical object is smaller. You know what I mean? It's like thinner. And the thinness of the product itself corresponds to a thinness of coverage. So they are in decline, but they are not irrelevant. Even today, in most cities around the United States, the biggest newsroom in town is still the local newspaper, even though it might be half or even 40% of what it once was. It's still the largest congregation of journalists in that town. A typical NPR station, if you have one, might have 2 reporters, 3 if you're lucky. The TV stations have a handful, but mostly what they do is either chase sports, weathers, and fires, or they report on what the newspaper is reporting. So that isn't really a factor. Talk radio doesn't have journalists. So they're diminished, but they're still important. And it's still important to support them if you can, but they are not anymore the kind of first stop in the information diet that they used to be, and they've lost a lot of their authority locally. So it used to be that if the big expose or investigation landed on the front page of the local newspaper, everybody in the power structure in that town had to react to that story. Now a lot of people in power realize they can ignore what's in the newspaper because it doesn't reach enough people.
This person writes, a speaker last week here at Chautauqua stated that an overly aggressive press prevents high-quality people from entering politics. Your comments?
I think that can happen sometime. I think especially when the press doesn't respect a very important dividing line between public and private. That can be very discouraging to people going into public life. And I think sometimes good people are probably discouraged from serving in office or competing for office because of that focus on people's families and digging into their private life. On the other hand, and this goes not just for politicians but for everybody, nobody who speaks up in public is guaranteed a safe ride. I mean, that's just not how democracy works. There are risks to entering into public life. If you stand up at a town hall meeting and you give your view, there's a risk that somebody will disagree with you. So that is part of public speech. It's part of participating in a democracy, is that you're not the king, you know, you're not royalty. You're just a citizen like other people, and because everybody else is on the same plane as you are legally, you can't be protected from criticism, and that includes criticism from the press. So I agree and I disagree with that. I think eroding the line between public and private is a big problem, but people who put themselves into the public eye should be subjected to scrutiny, sometimes very harsh scrutiny.
There are a couple of questions regarding anonymous sources. One, this question of what happens to the whole notion of anonymous sources in this age, especially your comments about open and closed. And then this other question, how can a reporter demonstrate research and accuracy and still keep sources anonymous?
Yeah. Well, anonymous sources are definitely a problem. They're a problem in two ways. Well, one is increasingly it's impossible to find out what's going on inside the government, especially when it comes to national security, without anonymous sources. And in the current environment, a lot of people within the government have a great deal of reservations about what is happening. And the only way that information can come out is through anonymous sources. But anonymous sources are very difficult to trust, and they are very easy to shout down. And it's effortless for the president to say, there are no sources, and those are fake sources, because you can't do what I said earlier. You can't say, don't believe me, check for yourself. Don't believe me, ask the source. That's impossible when it comes to anonymous sources. So on the one hand, I understand why our major news organizations are relying on anonymous sources more and more. But on the other hand, as they do that, they are in many ways making the trust problem worse. And there's another wrinkle here, which is even trickier. If I grant anonymity to you as my source, I receive the information you have for me, I withhold your name from the public. Sometimes who the source is bigger information than what they said. You know what I mean? And if the name of the source is more informative than what they actually offered by way of information, there's no way for the public to review that. There's no court of appeal. There's no check on that power to grant anonymity. The only possible check would be if reporters tried to find out who each other's sources are. But they don't. They have sort of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, to kind of not do that. Because if they started to investigate each other's sources, then there would be like chaos. Right? So that's a wrinkle that's especially difficult. And sometimes, for example, you might discover that the source for anonymous information about the White House is Donald Trump. He is known to do that. And that would be very embarrassing, not only for him, but for the reporters, right, who are relying on such an unreliable source. So it's a problem. There's no easy solution to that problem. I don't expect our journalists to stop using anonymous sources, but every time they do, it's like, follow me on this analogy now, it's like they're making a withdrawal from the trust bank. You know what I mean? Whereas, don't believe me, look for yourself, is a deposit in the trust bank. And so this is another way to look at anonymous sources, is that they are eroding an asset that they themselves cannot create.
Another question from Twitter. Are there different levels of trust looking between national media and smaller community news organizations and the audiences they serve?
Answer is yes. You know this phenomena where people hate Congress and they support their congressman? You know what I'm talking about? There's an element of this in media trust as well, where the one thing everybody mistrusts is the media. One of the reasons that they mistrust the media so much is that nobody knows what the media is, right? It doesn't have an address. You can't actually locate the media. Nobody's in charge of the media. But they tend to give the sources of information they rely on themselves, their newspaper, much higher trust ratings than the media. So there is a difference there.
There's a question here about the role of fact-check organizations and how effective they are today.
At one time, people like myself and observers of the scene in journalism placed a great deal of faith in fact-checking because it was new and it was different, it was aggressive, it was important. Years ago, like 20 years ago, when there was a misleading ad, for example, in a political campaign, the way political journalists dealt with that was not to fact-check it and say these claims are false, but instead they would kind of assess the strategy of the ad. You know what I mean? Like they would tell you how clever it was in its manipulations. And it was good that that sentiment kind of dissolved in favor of fact-checking. But now where you have these very strong currents I talked about in my lecture to ignore facts and to shout them down and to discredit the fact givers and to conduct culture war around facts and verification and reverse, today fact-checking looks like kind of like a squirt gun aimed at a house fire. You know, it's going in the right direction, but there's not enough of it. It's too small of an effect to actually change the situation. So I think people in the fact-checking movement, and there is a movement, it's like an international thing, fact-checking is part of a shift in practice in journalism, was very important, and it's global. I think people in that movement have to figure out, like, what's the next act in fact-checking, because the way it's operating now isn't having the effect that it should have.
Somewhat related, this person asks, who or what can serve as a check on the media when it does step over the line and there is a bias and a herd mentality that has a particular viewpoint?
Well, that's a good question. I think professional conscience and argument and debate among people in journalism, journalists disagreeing with each other, criticizing each other, arguing about best practices is part of it. I think my institution, the journalism schools of America, have a role in that. Also, journalists have been brought much closer to their readers, viewers, listeners than they've ever been before through the internet, through social media. And so the audience itself has a major role in pushing back on unfair practices, and that is something that we see all the time. Another answer to that question would be ombudsmen and public editors. Unfortunately, they are disappearing, which is, in my view, a very unwise development, very mistaken shift in major news organizations, that they're getting rid of these people who are able to receive complaints and find out what happened and then publicize what went wrong when a story is miscovered. So public editors, ombudsman would be another answer. And I think journalists who are smart and confident in themselves realize that when you say, we made a mistake, we blew this story, or this went off the rails, and you explain why, and you dig into it and you level with your public, it can actually improve your credibility. It's actually improve trust. So making mistakes is actually an opportunity to strengthen trust. There's been a couple of times myself online where I got something very wrong just in my own social media presence. Like I really blew it. And by writing about what I did and how badly I screwed up, and then promoting that, it actually, I think, made the people who follow me trust me more. So I think there's a way to recover from mistakes and blown stories that can actually improve trust.
There are a number of questions here that ask you to maybe reflect back on the Obama administration and issues of transparency and the promise of transparency of that administration.
Right. Well, Obama did say he wanted the most transparent administration in American history. I think most people in professional journalism would say he did not achieve that, primarily because of his belief in surveillance, his drone war, which was a very difficult thing for accountability, and the way in which he tried to prosecute leak investigations and use the Espionage Act, which is a 1927 law, generally regarded as the worst law on the books for civil libertarians, to prosecute leakers. And he, a couple of times, caught in the net of the leak investigations journalists who were talking to those people. So he was very aggressive on leaks. And he was also not very good on freedom of information requests and sort of slow walking those through the bureaucracy. So for a variety of reasons, which I am not clear exactly why, like what agenda of his was being served by doing this, but nonetheless, in those ways that I just outlined, he was to most journalists a great disappointment on transparency, and in some ways did set the table for President Trump to come along and be even worse.
Person asks, how are journalism schools and journalism students handling this current crisis? Is attendance declining in journalism schools?
Well, no, it's not. Although at the undergraduate level at NYU, when I was director of the program, we instituted a change where you cannot be a journalism major only at NYU. You have to double major in journalism and liberal arts. And we did that so that nobody is sort of putting all their chips on journalism, and they are learning about something else about the world to infuse their journalism education with deeper knowledge. So we haven't seen a decline in majors, but not all of our majors are necessarily people saying, I'm going to be a journalist. They are, in many ways, trying to learn about the media world that they live in. At the graduate level, we're about the same that we've been. However, a very large majority of our students are women. And that's an interesting trend that's been going on for a long time in journalism school. How are they reacting to this moment? A lot of NYU students, because we're in New York as opposed to Washington, are not primarily focused on national politics. They're much more interested in culture reporting, science reporting, business reporting. So they tend to be a little bit less engaged in these kinds of battles that I talked about in my lecture today.
I want to end with a question. We've received several questions along these lines. What is my civic responsibility to ensure the preservation of the Fourth Estate?
Yeah. It's a really good question. There are a few easy answers to that. I mean, one of them is pay attention to what's going on, listen to the news, read, and try and use more than one source of information to form your understanding of the world. Triangulate sources of information to get a better grip on it. That's one thing. Another thing is that everybody who is a citizen of the United States has to understand that our democracy doesn't sort of go by itself just because we have the Constitution. In addition to the Constitution and the formal mechanisms that it sets up, we've always needed two other things to make it work. One is civil society, a sense of civic responsibility, which means paying attention, participating in government, in elections, teaching your children that they have a role to play as citizens as well, respectfully disagreeing with one another, instead of suffering in silence, going to the meeting and speaking out, expecting public-spirited behavior in people who in power, holding people in power accountable. Those are things that the law cannot guarantee that. It comes from what de Tocqueville called the spirit of the people. Right? So we need that for the Constitution to work. The other thing that we need for the Constitution to work is movements, social movements. Many of the great leaps in progress we've made in this country have come about not because the political system changed, but because movements of people outside the political system forced it to change. And without movements, constitutional government here doesn't really work. So in addition to paying attention, we have to try and create a civic culture that can endure after we're gone. And we have to realize that American democracy doesn't work unless we have both government and movements. And if I could add one more thing on this, this kind of institution, Chautauqua institution, is exactly what is necessary for there to be a democracy. Because it helps recreate those habits of being informed, listening and speaking, being able to disagree without killing each other, and other sorts of civilizing instincts that are necessary to even have a democracy. So my final word to you would be, it's not a machine that goes by itself. It doesn't work that way. We have to power that machine.
Please join me in thanking Jay Rosen.